Henry Caldwell buried his wife on a Tuesday in March 1856 under a cottonwood tree on their property in Dakota Territory. The ground was still half frozen, made digging difficult, but he'd insisted on doing it himself. Every shovelful, every inch of depth. Margaret would rest in earth her husband had moved with his own hands. She'd asked for that spot specifically, 3 weeks before the consumption finally took her, when speaking had become almost impossible, but her mind remained sharp as winter ice. "Not the town cemetery," Margaret had whispered, each word costing her breath she could barely spare. Her voice was thin as paper, body wasted to bones and determination. "I don't want to be with strangers, Henry. I want to be here, on our land, where I can stay close to you and the house we built together." Henry had held her hand, feeling the bones too prominent beneath skin. "You'll get better. Spring's coming. Warmer weather helps. Don't." She'd squeezed his hand with surprising strength. "I'm dying. We both know it. But I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of being forgotten, of being far from you." "You could never be forgotten. Promise me something." Her grey eyes, once bright as creek water, now faded but still fierce. "Promise you'll build something. Something that keeps you close to me and keeps you safe when winter comes. Don't let the cold take you the way this sickness is taking me. Promise." He'd promised, not understanding what she meant, just wanting to give her peace. 3 weeks later, she was gone. Her last words were about the cottonwood tree, about staying close, about building something that would matter. So Henry buried her there, 50 feet from their cabin door. In a grave he'd dug 6 feet deep with his own hands, despite being 61 years old. Their 3 adult children came for the funeral, arriving separately, dressed in city clothes that looked strange against the raw Dakota landscape. William, 32, who'd moved to St. Louis 15 years ago and made money in shipping. He'd sent money home occasionally, but visited rarely. Stood at the grave in a black suit that cost more than Henry's entire wardrobe, face composed in appropriate sorrow that seemed somehow performative. Caroline, 29, married to a banker in Chicago named Edward Pritchard. She'd left at 17, eager to escape frontier hardship. Now she stood at her mother's grave in mourning clothes from a Chicago dressmaker, crying genuine tears, but unable to hide her impatience to leave again. And Thomas, 26, who'd stayed in Dakota but lived 40 miles south, running a freight business, the closest geographically, but perhaps the most distant emotionally. He'd inherited his father's practical nature, but used it to escape frontier poverty rather than endure it. They stayed 3 days after the burial, helping Henry sort through Margaret's things with the efficiency of people dividing an estate, speaking in those careful, modulated voices people use around the bereaved. Voices that say, "We're sorry for your loss," while thinking, "When can we leave?" On the 3rd day they departed, returning to their successful lives in their comfortable cities. William back to his shipping manifests, Caroline to her banker's wife's social obligations, Thomas to his profitable freight routes, leaving Henry alone in the cabin that suddenly felt too large and too empty, with nothing but Margaret's grave 50 feet away and her last request echoing in his mind. "Build something that keeps you close to me and keeps you safe when winter comes." 2 weeks after the funeral, Henry started digging, not because he had a clear plan, but because Margaret's words wouldn't leave him alone. Build something. Stay close. Stay safe. He began in the southwest corner of his cabin, inside, moving aside the bed he and Margaret had shared for 34 years, the bed where she'd died. The bed he couldn't sleep in anymore without feeling the absence beside him like a physical wound. He pulled up the floorboards carefully, one at a time, stacking them along the wall. Each board 12 inches wide, oak he'd milled himself 15 years ago when they'd built this place. Solid, well made, but in his way now. Then he started removing earth, Not randomly, methodically, like the miner he'd been for 20 years before coming to Dakota Territory. Henry Caldwell was 61 years old, but his body remembered Nevada silver mines, remembered working 3,000 feet underground in darkness and heat, remembered how to read rock, shore walls, create spaces that wouldn't collapse and kill you. He dug straight down first, creating a shaft 4 feet square, removed earth bucket by bucket, using a hand-cranked windlass he'd built from scrap lumber. Every bucket weighed 40 pounds. He lifted hundreds, thousands. 6 feet down, he hit the frost line. Below that, Earth stayed constant temperature year-round. 55 degrees in summer, 55 degrees in winter, geothermal stability that most people ignored, but miners understood intimately. At 7 feet depth, he stopped digging down and started digging outward, creating a room, 8 feet by 12 feet initially, though he'd expand later. 7 feet of headroom, enough for a man his height to stand upright. He removed the earth systematically, bucket by bucket, carrying it outside under cover of darkness, spreading it in the forest where no one would notice. 200 buckets per day when his back allowed. 40 pounds times 200 equals 4 tons of earth moved daily. It took him 3 months of constant work. 3 months of waking with his body screaming protest. 3 months of blistered hands and aching shoulders. 3 months alone in the dark, creating something no one knew about, something Margaret had asked for in words he was only beginning to understand. The engineering was critical. He shored up walls with timber every 3 feet, creating a grid of support beams. Used cedar where he could afford it, oak where he couldn't. Each beam measured and notched precisely so the weight distribution was perfect. He lined the walls with clay he mixed himself, water and earth blended to proper consistency, spread 2 inches thick to seal against moisture. The clay would prevent seepage, keep the dugout dry even in spring thaw. For the ceiling, he created a double layer. First, heavy timber beams 12 inches apart, then planking across those beams. Then, a layer of prairie sod cut thick, grass roots holding it together. Then 2 feet of earth on top of that. Finally, the cabin floorboards replaced carefully so no one would know. 7 feet of material between the dugout ceiling and the sky. 7 feet of insulation that would hold geothermal warmth in winter, keep cool air in summer. He installed ventilation using 4-inch pipe that ran horizontally through the cabin wall at ground level, hidden behind furniture. Fresh air would enter passively, stale air would exit through the stove chimney. For heat, he built a small stove using sheet metal and clay, with a chimney pipe that vented through one of the cabin's existing chimneys. From outside, you'd see normal smoke. You'd never know it came from 7 feet underground. He worked alone, telling no one, trusting no one. This was between him and Margaret, between him and survival, between him and the promise he'd made to a dying woman. When William came to visit in June, unexpected and unannounced, arriving with the confidence of someone who owned whatever space he occupied, he found his father's cabin floor torn up in one corner, a ladder descending into darkness that smelled of fresh earth and clay. "Father, what in God's name are you doing?" Henry climbed up from the dugout, covered in dirt that had worked into every crease of his clothing, every line of his face. He looked older than William remembered, thinner, more gaunt, the kind of thin that comes from forgetting to eat, from working through meals, from obsession replacing nutrition. Building something. William walked slowly around the opening, looking down into darkness his eyes couldn't penetrate. Building what exactly? "Father, I need you to explain this to me clearly. You've removed the floor. You've excavated beneath your own house. This is... He searched for words that wouldn't sound accusatory, failed. This is insane behavior. It's engineering. It's a grave. You're digging a grave under your own bedroom. Father, do you not see how this appears? A man loses his wife, immediately starts excavating beneath his bed. The symbolism alone is deeply troubling." Henry just looked at his son, this well-dressed stranger who understood shipping manifests but had forgotten how to survive. It's not a grave. It's a dugout. 7 feet deep. 8 by 12 feet of living space. Properly shored. Clay-lined walls. Ventilation system. It's engineered shelter. Shelter from what? You have a house, this house, which you're actively undermining, possibly literally. The foundation, Father. You're weakening the structural foundation. The entire cabin could collapse into this pit you're digging. Won't collapse. The foundation was built on corner posts. Those posts go down 5 feet. The dugout doesn't intersect them. The excavation is between foundation points, properly shored with load-bearing timbers every 3 feet. I know what I'm doing. William ran his hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration he'd inherited from his mother. That's not the point. The point is why. Why are you doing this? What possible purpose could an underground room serve? Your mother asked me to build something that would keep me close to her and keep me safe when winter comes. This does both. And then Mother was dying when she said that. Delirious. She didn't literally mean dig a hole in the ground. Henry's voice went cold. Don't tell me what your mother meant. She was lucid until her last breath, and she knew Dakota winters. Survived 15 of them while you were off in St. Louis, living in heated buildings that never see below 40 degrees inside. Father, please, listen to yourself. You're 61 years old, working yourself to exhaustion, digging holes in the ground like some deranged badger. This isn't normal behavior. This is grief, expressing itself in destructive ways. Destructive? Henry laughed without humor. I'm building. Building is the opposite of destructive. You're obsessing. There's a difference. William softened his voice, used the tone he employed with difficult ship captains. Father, I understand. Mother's death was devastating. We're all grieving. But grief does things to the mind, makes people act irrationally, makes them fixate on projects that seem meaningful but are actually just displacement behavior. You think I'm displacement behaving? I think you should come stay with me in St. Louis for a while. Take a break from this place, from Mother's grave 50 feet from your door, from the memories, from this project. Come to the city, see doctors, rest. I'm not leaving, not until this is finished. And when will it be finished? When you've dug so deep the cabin collapses, when you've worked yourself into your own heart attack. When does this end? Henry looked at his son, saw the genuine concern mixed with judgment, the care mixed with the assumption of authority. It ends when I've built what your mother asked me to build, something that keeps me close to her and keeps me safe. You don't have to understand it, William, but you do need to leave me alone to finish it. William left frustrated, angry, worried. He stopped at the settlement 5 miles north, posted letters to Caroline and Thomas, letters that described their father's condition in clinical terms. Obsessive excavation project, possible dementia, weight loss, social withdrawal, irrational explanations involving deceased spouse, recommend intervention. The letters reached his siblings within 2 weeks. The family correspondence began in earnest. Caroline came in July with her banker husband, Edward. They found Henry completing the dugout, installing a small stove with a chimney that vented through a hidden pipe to the surface. Father, William wrote us about your project. We're concerned. Henry was lining the dugout walls with clay, sealing them against moisture. No need for concern. I'm perfectly sound. Edward, the banker, studied the underground room with professional assessment. Mr. Caldwell, I must say, this appears to be a significant expenditure of effort for no discernible purpose. You're elderly, living alone. This property should be prepared for sale or transfer to family, not undermined with unnecessary excavation. My property, my excavation. But Father, Caroline's voice broke slightly, it's like you're building your own crypt. Like you want to be buried alive. It's morbid, unhealthy. Mother's death has affected you more deeply than you'll admit. Your mother understood. Understood what? That sometimes you build things not because they make sense to other people. You build them because they need to exist. They left frustrated, and the letters between siblings intensified. Father is displaying classic signs of senility. The Dugout project is irrational. He's isolated, possibly dangerous to himself. We should consider legal guardianship. Thomas came in September, the most direct of the three. Found Henry installing storage shelves in the dugout, stocking it with preserved food, water barrels, firewood. Father, stop. Just stop for a minute and listen to me. Thomas climbed down the ladder into the underground room, looking around at what his father had built. This is madness. You've spent 4 months digging a hole that serves no purpose. You're living alone, talking to yourself, obsessing over this underground cave like some animal preparing to hibernate. It's not a cave, it's a dugout, proper construction. 7 feet of earth overhead for insulation, clay-lined walls to prevent moisture, ventilation system, stove for heat. This is engineered, not obsessed. Engineered for what purpose? Survival. Survival of what? Father, you're not rational. William and Caroline and we've been discussing this. We think you need help, professional help. There are facilities where elderly people who've lost touch with reality can be cared for properly. Henry looked at his younger son with something like pity. You think I've lost my mind because I'm preparing for winter? You're not preparing for winter. You're digging your own grave and calling it preparation. Father, please, come stay with me. Sell this property. You don't need to live alone in the wilderness anymore. Mother's gone. Your children are grown. You've done your time on the frontier. Let us take care of you. I don't need taking care of. I need you to leave me alone, to finish what I started. Thomas left angry, and the siblings made plans. We'll return in spring, William wrote to the others. Present a unified front. Father cannot continue this way. The property should be sold. Father moved to proper accommodation. His behavior indicates diminished capacity. Henry read none of these letters. He was too busy completing his dugout. By October, it was finished. A fully functional underground room beneath his cabin, accessible only through a trapdoor hidden under his bed. 7 feet of earth overhead, walls lined with clay and timber, a small stove for heat, storage for 6 months of food and water, sleeping pallet, books, everything needed for extended habitation. He'd spent every dollar of savings Margaret had left him, bought timber, clay, stovepipe, supplies. The money his children expected to inherit, spent on what they called his madness. But Henry knew something his educated, successful children had forgotten. He knew Dakota Territory, knew its winters, knew what happened when temperatures dropped 40 below and stayed there for weeks, knew how people died in their own homes when wood ran out, when walls failed, when cold became something animate and murderous. He'd survived winters here for 15 years. His children had left, seeking easier lives in cities with coal heat and insulated buildings. They'd forgotten what winter meant on the frontier, but Henry remembered, and he'd built accordingly. The test came in January 1857, not gradually, not with warning, with the sudden brutality that Dakota winter specialized in. The temperature had been dropping for 3 days, steady and ominous. January 10th, it hit 0 degrees at noon. By evening, -5. January 11th, -10 at dawn, -15 by noon. The kind of cold that made breath freeze mid-air, that made spit turn to ice before hitting ground. January 12th, -20 degrees all day. Wind starting to pick up from the north, that particular wind that came straight down from the Arctic, with nothing to stop it across 1,000 miles of empty plains. On January 13th, William arrived unexpectedly with Caroline and Thomas. A unified front, just as they'd planned in their letters. The three successful children coming to confront their increasingly erratic father about his irrational behavior, his wasted inheritance, his need for proper supervision in a facility where trained professionals could manage his decline. They arrived in the afternoon, three siblings in Thomas's freight wagon, bundled against cold that was already brutal. -25 degrees, wind building, the kind of weather where exposed skin freezes in minutes. They'd planned carefully. Arrive in afternoon, have serious family discussion over supper, present unified concerns. Tomorrow morning, begin process of selling property, relocating father to appropriate accommodation. It would be difficult. Henry would resist. But they were three adults with legal authority, and he was one elderly man, displaying clear signs of diminished capacity. They didn't plan on the blizzard. It hit at sunset like a physical assault. Temperature plunged from -25 to -35 in 30 minutes, then -40. The sky turned grey, then white, then disappeared entirely behind snow so thick it became a solid thing. Wind came screaming out of the north at 50 miles per hour, 60, impossible to measure because it knocked down anything trying to measure it. The sound was like freight trains, like artillery, like the earth itself screaming. Henry's cabin, built well but built 15 years ago with materials available then, began losing heat immediately. The walls were solid log construction, properly chinked. The roof was sound, recently repaired. The stove was good iron, burning hot. None of it mattered. The cold was too much, the wind too strong. It found every microscopic gap, every place where chinking had shrunk with age, every join that wasn't perfect. Drove through walls like they were cloth. Pulled heat from the room faster than fire could replace it. By 6 o'clock, 2 hours into the blizzard, it was 20 degrees inside the cabin, despite a roaring fire that consumed wood at terrifying speed. William, Caroline, and Thomas huddled around the stove, burning through Henry's carefully gathered wood supply, and still couldn't stop shaking. By 7 o'clock, 15 degrees inside, ice forming on the inside of the windows, water bucket beginning to freeze. By 8 o'clock, 10 degrees inside the cabin. The fire was as large as they dared make it without risking chimney fire, wood vanishing into flame that produced more light than heat. And still the temperature dropped. Caroline was crying, not from emotion, but from cold so intense her body was responding involuntarily. "Father, we're freezing. Can't you make the fire bigger?" Henry looked at the fire consuming his wood supply, did the math. Fire's as big as it can safely be. Problem isn't fire output. Problem is the cabin can't hold heat. Winds finding every gap in the chinking, colds penetrating through the walls. Log conducts temperature. We'd need 4 times this much wood to keep this space warm through the night, and we don't have it. Maybe have enough for 3 more hours at this rate. Then what do we do? William asked, the practical businessman still trying to find logical solution, even as his fingers turned white with cold. Henry looked at his 3 children, these successful adults who'd come to declare him incompetent, who thought his project was madness, who planned to institutionalize him for his own good. "We go down." "Down where?" "The dugout, the tomb you think I've been building." He walked to the corner where his bed usually stood, shoved it aside with strength that surprised them, revealed the trapdoor they'd known about, but dismissed as part of their father's delusion. Henry opened it. Warm air rose from below, visible in the cold cabin, carrying the smell of earth and clay and impossibly warmth. "That?" Thomas stared into the opening, seeing ladder rungs descending into darkness, lit by a single lantern far below. "That's your solution? We hide in a hole in the ground like animals?" "We survive in an engineered shelter designed exactly for this situation. There's a difference." Henry started down the ladder, moving with practiced ease despite his age. "Coming or freezing? Your choice. But decide fast. Every second this door is open, we lose heat below." They came. What choice did they have? Pride doesn't keep you warm at 10 degrees. Dignity doesn't prevent frostbite. Skepticism about your father's sanity matters exactly zero when the alternative is dying. William first, practical enough to recognize when argument was pointless. Then Caroline, crying harder now, but moving. Finally Thomas, the last holdout, the one most convinced their father had lost touch with reality. They descended into earth, into warmth that seemed impossible, into the shelter their mockery had dismissed. The dugout was small, cramped with 4 people, but it was warm, impossibly warm. The small stove burned with minimal wood, and the temperature held at 65 degrees, 7 feet of earth overhead, holding geothermal warmth, stopping the cold from penetrating. The frontier principle Henry's children had forgotten. Sometimes survival means going down instead of up, means surrendering to earth instead of fighting sky. They stayed in that underground room for 4 days while the blizzard raged. 4 days of being forced together in a space barely larger than a prison cell. 4 days of watching their father calmly manage resources, maintain temperature, keep them alive with the very thing they'd called madness. On the second day, William spoke first. "Father, I need to apologize." Henry was preparing a simple meal on the dugout's small stove. "For what?" "For thinking you'd lost your mind. For the letters I wrote to Caroline and Thomas. For planning to declare you incompetent and take control of your property." Henry didn't look up from his cooking. "You wrote those things because you forgot what it means to live out here. Cities make you soft, make you forget that survival isn't about looking sane. It's about staying alive." "But how did you know?" Caroline asked. "How did you know to build this, to prepare for something like this storm?" "I didn't know specifics, but I knew winter would come. Knew Dakota winter could kill. Your mother, before she died, she made me promise something." "What?" Henry was quiet for a long moment. "She said, build something that will keep you close to me and keep you safe when winter comes. Don't let the cold take you like the sickness took me." I interpreted that literally. "Built a shelter beneath our house, close to where she's buried, that would keep me alive no matter what winter did." Thomas wiped his eyes. "We thought you were building a tomb. I was building a lifeline. There's a difference." On the 3rd day, they heard sounds from above, creaking, groaning, then a massive crack. "What was that?" Caroline clutched her father's arm. Henry checked his support beams, his carefully engineered ceiling structure. "Cabin roof. Probably collapsed under snow weight or wind pressure. The cabin's collapsing. The cabin's failing. This dugout isn't. That's why it exists." They sat in silence, listening to their childhood home destroy itself above them while they remained safe below. On the 4th day, the wind stopped. Temperature rose to -15, which felt tropical by comparison. They emerged from the dugout to find Henry's cabin partially collapsed. The north wall had failed. The roof had caved in on one side. Everything inside was destroyed or frozen solid, but they were alive, warm, safe, because of the madness they'd mocked. William walked around the remains of his childhood home, then went to his mother's grave. Stood there a long time. When he came back, his face was different. "Father, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you my life. We all do." "You don't owe me anything. You're my children. We plan to take your property, declare you incompetent, put you in an institution. Because we'd forgotten what you knew all along, that out here, survival looks different than it does in cities. That wisdom isn't about being normal. It's about being prepared." Henry looked at the ruins of his cabin, at the entrance to his dugout that had saved 4 lives. "Your mother understood that. She lived through 15 Dakota winters. She knew what it required. When she asked me to build something that would keep me close and keep me safe, she wasn't being sentimental. She was being practical." "Will you rebuild?" Thomas asked. "Yes, but better. I'll rebuild the cabin, but I'll keep the dugout." Expand it, maybe. Make it so it can shelter more people if needed. We'll help, Caroline said quietly, if you'll let us. Henry looked at his 3 children, these people who'd needed to almost die to remember where they came from. I'd like that. They stayed 2 weeks, helping Henry salvage what could be saved, planning the reconstruction. When they finally left, the dynamic had changed. They no longer spoke to him with the careful condescension used for the senile. They spoke to him with respect. William returned in March with lumber, hired workers, money. They rebuilt the cabin larger than before, proper insulation, reinforced against wind and snow. But they kept the dugout, expanded it, made it a permanent shelter space that could house 10 people in emergency. By winter of 1857, word had spread. The man who'd built the underground room that survived the Great Blizzard. Other homesteaders came to see it, to learn the engineering, to understand how 7 feet of earth could provide better shelter than 12 inches of wood. Henry became an unlikely expert, teaching others how to dig properly, shore correctly, create underground spaces that would hold through any winter. A dozen families built dugout shelters that year, copying his design. His children visited more often now, brought grandchildren Henry barely knew, talked about the frontier with new respect, new understanding that their father's way of life wasn't backward. It was sophisticated in ways they'd failed to see. Margaret's grave became a place they all visited, taking turns, understanding now what she'd asked Henry to build and why. Henry Caldwell lived another 19 years, dying in 1875 at age 80. By then, he'd helped engineer 43 underground shelters across Dakota Territory, had saved countless lives by teaching people that sometimes survival means going down into earth instead of standing proud against sky. His children inherited the property as they'd always planned, but they didn't sell it. They maintained it, including the dugout as a kind of monument, to their mother who'd asked for practical love, to their father who'd delivered it, to the frontier principle that wisdom looks like madness right up until it saves your life. The cabin stood until 1901, when it finally burned in a kitchen fire, but the dugout remained, solid and secure, carved into earth that doesn't burn, doesn't rot, doesn't fail. Local historians marked it in 1923. Put up a small sign, Caldwell Dugout, built 1856, saved 4 lives during Great Blizzard 1857, example of frontier engineering and father's love. The sign didn't mention the children who'd called it madness, didn't mention the letters planning institutionalization, didn't mention how close they'd come to stopping him. It just mentioned survival, which was all Henry had ever cared about anyway.